Have you ever thought about how a single place can hold centuries of pain, and how a history that brutal doesn't just stay in the past, but actually echoes down through generations, shaping the lives of people who were never even there? Well, we're not just talking about passing down sad stories here. There's a real concept for this, intergenerational trauma, and research shows that this stuff can leave very real marks, psychological and even biological ones. Think about it, a heightened stress response, a predisposition to anxiety. These things can literally be passed from one generation to the next. And that brings us to an even more fascinating, almost haunting idea called post-memory. This is the sense that you can be affected by, even carry, a memory you never directly experienced yourself. It's like feeling the weight and the wounds of a past that really belongs to your ancestors.
So can we really inherit the memories and the pain of those who came before us? That is the big, profound question we're going to dive into today. We'll look at a historic fortress on the coast of Ghana, an incredible novel it inspired, and its very real concept of inherited wounds.
All right, so here's our game plan. We'll start with the wounds we inherit, then explore a castle of two worlds. From there, we'll follow two sisters with two very different destinies, listen for the echoes of history, and finally, see what it takes to reconnect a broken line. So let's get right into it with A Castle of Two Worlds. Our entire story is anchored in a real physical place you can visit today, Cape Coast Castle in Ghana. It's one of about 40 of these so-called slave castles that European traders built all along the West African coast. For centuries, this fort was a hot commodity for European powers. It was originally built by the Swedish in 1653, and back then it was all about trading timber and gold. But, just a decade later, the English captured it, and its purpose shifted to a much, much darker commodity: human beings. And this right here just perfectly captures the castle's horrifying split personality. You see, above ground, European governors and soldiers were living in relative luxury, conducting business on these well-paved courtyards. But directly beneath their feet, in these massive dungeons carved from solid rock, was a world of unimaginable human suffering.
In fact, just listen to how this 18th century French traveler Jean Barbeau described it. He doesn't call it a prison, he calls it a spacious mansion to keep slaves in. That language alone is so telling, right? It shows how these dungeons were engineered not for punishment, but as holding pens, as warehouses for human cargo.
And from these dungeons, people were led through this small, dark opening in the seawall. It was known as the Gate of No Return. For hundreds of thousands of individuals, this castle was the very last piece of their homeland they would ever see. Okay, so we have this brutal physical space. Now let's see how that very building inspired a modern literary masterpiece, Yak Yassi's novel Homegoing, which brings this history to life in such a deeply personal and powerful way. The author's visit to Cape Coast Castle was the direct inspiration for her book. A tour guide mentioned to her that the British soldiers who worked there often married local Fonte women, and that single fact just sparked the whole idea, this stunning juxtaposition of a soldier's wife living upstairs while an enslaved woman was imprisoned right down below.
So the story splits into two completely different paths. It follows two daughters of the same mother. They're half-sisters, but they never know the other exists. And their fates diverge dramatically, right there inside the walls of Cape Coast Castle.
And this is basically the entire 300-year structure of the novel laid out. One sister, Effia, marries a British trader and lives upstairs. Her descendants stay in Ghana, and their story is one of grappling with colonialism. The other sister, Epsi, is captured, imprisoned in the dungeons, and then sent to America. Her descendants endure the horrors of slavery and everything that comes after. It's like two family trees growing from the exact same root, but on opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean.
So that brings us to the big question. How does the novel actually show this trauma being passed down through the family lines? Well, it does it through these really powerful recurring symbols that haunt the characters for centuries.
These symbols act like what one critic called a primal scar. For Effia's family line back in Ghana, fire becomes this recurring nightmare, a symbol of destruction. For AC's line in America, it's water that carries the memory of loss and the rootlessness of the Middle Passage. And the one thing connecting them both is a black stone pendant, a real, physical object passed down through both lines, representing a heritage that was shattered but not completely erased. And the novel doesn't just hint at this, it says it outright, right from the very beginning.
After a fire marks Ephia's birth, her father has this premonition that the wreckage left by this one event will just reverberate for generations and generations to come.
This is a perfect example of that post-memory idea we talked about. Generations later, a descendant named Aqua is tormented by these terrible nightmares of a woman made of fire. She has no clue where this vision comes from, but it's an incarnation of her family's pain, a trauma she's inherited without ever knowing its source.
Meanwhile, on the other side of the family, just before she's forced through the gate of no return, Az swallows her pendant. And this is such a profound act of preservation. It shows how the most sacred parts of who you are, your family, your identity, your history, sometimes have to be buried deep inside, just so they can survive.
And finally, after 300 years of separation and suffering, the novel's two storylines, these two broken family lines, they finally come together in the present day.
Two characters, Marjorie from Ephia's line and Marcus from S's, at last meet. This reunion is just so symbolic because it bridges that massive historical and geographical divide that was created all those centuries ago, right there at Cape Coast Castle.
And of course, the Blackstone pendant reappears. The novel seems to be suggesting that while the pain of history is undeniably real and definitely inherited, identity is something that can be searched for, struggled over, and ultimately rebuilt from all those broken pieces of the past.
The novel's final character, Marcus, really grapples with this. He's a PhD student trying to research his family's history, and he struggles with this impossible task of conveying the sheer weight of it all, of being part of a story so large, so impossibly vast, that it's easy to forget we even exist inside of it.
You know, when you put it all together, what this really shows us is that history isn't just some collection of events that are over and done with. It's a living, breathing force that leaves echoes and wounds. And understanding those echoes, whether it's through visiting a place like Cape Coast Castle or reading a story like Homegoing, is absolutely essential to understanding ourselves.
It really leaves you with a question, doesn't it? How do the stories of our own ancestors, the ones we know and the ones we don't, shape who we are today? It's a reminder that every one of us exists inside a long, intricate story, one that began long before we were born and will continue long after we're gone.